Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Winsland, and I'm a senior consultant at Sistra in the UK bus team. And in collaboration with Landor Links, Sistra is hosting a webinar series about developing public transport to compete with private cars. And today I'll be chairing the first session, which is a discussion on how we build successful and genuinely integrated networks, and why they appear to be so difficult to deliver here in the UK. I'm joined this morning by a panel of industry experts and advocates, including David Connolly, who is Sistra's Director of Low Carbon Mobility, with 33 years' experience of appraising measures designed to influence travel behaviour in the UK and beyond. Gideon Salutin, who is the Transport Policy Lead at the Social Market Foundation, where he focuses on how decarbonising transport systems can decrease costs and put millions out of poverty. Beata Kubitz, an independent transport consultant focusing on shared transport and digitalisation. Her book, Mobility as a Service, Its Development, Deployment and Future, was published by the IET in April this year. And Melanie Watson, who has led public transport teams at TfL in Manchester and in Cornwall, and now works independently, advising authorities on how to drive improvements from both an urban and rural perspective. Each of our panelists, as we go through, will have around 10 minutes each to present, and then we will get to a round of questions and answers at the end. Questions can be submitted using the Q&A function on this call, not the normal chat, because that won't be monitored. So there's a separate Q&A function. So if you submit questions in writing as the presentations go on, I will then kind of direct them to the relevant people on the panel at the end. So with introductions out of the way, I will hand straight over to David.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen to... Can everybody now see that? I'll assume yes, and we'll keep going. Go to anti-presentation mode. Things hidden on my screen here. So yes, my name is David Connolly. My title is Director of Low Carbon Mobility, and I have been with MVN Sistra for most of my working life. So over 33 years, as Mark said, of multimodal appraisal, and I'm particularly interested in trying to ensure that public transport can compete with the car. So I'm not on this talk not going to be talking about where public transport is the only mode available to people. I am very much trying to reduce car use using good high quality public transport, and in particular removing fossil fuel use of single vehicles and replacing them with more sustainable and lower emitting public transport. So most of you on the call will probably know of Sistra. We're one of the world's leading engineering and transport consultancy groups specializing in mobility solutions. We have a very highly experienced senior teams, in fact, plural, for focusing on bus, rail and light rail schemes and operations. And our specialisms include all modes of rail and light rail, all aspects of those, bus operations, including expertise on different ways of regulating bus operations, franchising and municipalization partnerships and so forth. I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. We have a very strong fares and ticketing team, strategies, payment and payment technology. We have a lot of expertise in concessionary travel and supported fares, both evaluating those and ensuring that they remain fair for both the provider of the services and the travelling public and the taxpayer. We have a team specialising in customer insights and market research. We're very strong in data analytics and data visualization of ticket data and GIS and routing and so forth, visualizing the operation of your public transport. We are very strong in fuels, low emission technologies, and funding, various forms of funding for improvements to public transport. And my particular area of interest is EV, both for bus depots, electrifying bus depots, and EV charging strategies for the general public using private vehicles. So that's Sistra. Basically, they say the task to compete with those who have access to a private car or a taxi or a Uber or whatever. So the question is, what can we do to make the multi-occupant vehicle able to compete with those private car-based modes, basically. And it is, in my opinion, and I think several of our speakers sort of agree with this, but it is effectively the basics. Get the end-to-end basics right, and there are various components of those that you need to focus on as part of the whole experience, public transport. Generally, throughout this talk, I'm talking about buses, but most of what I'm saying could also be applied to rail, and I'll point out where there's special issues about longer distance travel by rail and coach if I have time. So in terms of the end-to-end journey, the first thing is you have to know that the bus is there, where to catch it, when the bus is coming, is there a bus, etc. There's no point in sort of turning up at a bus stop without that information. And obviously, some of our fellow speakers will talk about how that information is found, and that has to be by both locals and visitors. So how do you find where the bus or the train or the tram is and where it goes, and does it run on a Sunday and all that stuff? So basically, access to information is the first step. Then you have to be able to get to the bus stop, and that is access for all. So whether you're pushing a pram, in a wheelchair, unable to step up a curb, visually impaired, etc., you have to be able to get safely to the bus stop. And obviously in urban areas, or not obviously, generally in urban areas, you will have a pavement, but if that pavement doesn't have a drop curb, then you're effectively, there's a barrier. If you can't walk the distance that's needed to get to the bus stop because there's not one close enough to you, then that's an issue. And if there is no pavement at all in rural areas, then that's an even bigger issue. So basically getting to the bus stop is the second step. Then the whole bus stop experience, you have to be out of the rain. You probably would need some information to confirm that the bus that you are expected at that stop. Ideally, you would like something with a route on it so that you can check if you didn't check fully beforehand. So the whole bus stop experience is important, obviously, before you get anywhere near the bus or the tram or the train. Then the bus has to turn up on time when it was expected. It can't be cancelled. It can't be 20 minutes late, and this is particularly important for two of the biggest purposes, which is work and education, where you generally can't roll into work or school or your first lecture 20 minutes late just because the bus decided not to come. So that's a key one. Key aspect is what can you do to make sure that your bus and tram network run on time and continue to run once you're on it, basically. Then you buy a ticket, or you may have bought a ticket in advance, but assuming you get on the bus and you buy a ticket, that has to be reasonable. I would say it doesn't have to be free or very cheap, but it has to be reasonable. And in particular, you're going to be competing with the cost of the alternative, as I say, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So a reasonable fare, and we'll maybe debate what that means in a minute. And the payment should be convenient. So it used to be that was sort of cash or whatever, but now there's much more tap and go. Most people find that convenient, but not everyone. So how do you pay? Do you know what the fare is? How do you pay it? How easy is? How scary is the payment system, basically? Then on the journey, it would be nice if you had a seat and not sort of crammed in, crowded, a seat that you can get to again with your mobility issues. It should feel safe and be safe, and it should be as clean as possible. And probably the order of importance is, as I've listed them there, so that you are effectively enjoying the journey as much as you can. There's not people hassling you or screaming in your face or generally stopping you from sitting down on a seat that you can get to. So generally the journey, and the bus should be not too bumpy and etc. Just generally in ambience and in vehicle comfort is a fairly obvious feature. The journey time almost certainly can't be faster than the equivalent car drive time, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But generally it should be as efficient as possible, so not too many circuitous routes around the housing estates before you get going, and not sitting in stationary queues for longer than the cars have to, basically. And then you get to your destination, and then you need the onward journey, whether that's a connection at somewhere close to where you've got off your bus or tram onto another connected transport that you know is going to be there, and again drop curbs and ability to get to, and with enough signage to help you find where you're getting to without needing an O-level in mapping and route finding. So that's the basics, and I would claim that if you've got all of those things sorted, then you're half or more than halfway. You're 9/10 of the way there to having an attractive urban public transport. And I say I'm not at this point not talking about rural lifeline services. So generally speaking, most people would agree that's the list of things you have to think about. In my field, I've always been trying to estimate the mode split, the choice that people make between one mode and the other, whether that's to walk or take the bus, or to take the bus or drive, or get a taxi or whatever. So the mode, what are the seesaw of mode decisions, things affecting mode? And in particular, the choice, for those of you lucky enough to have access to a car, what's the things? Where are you considering the bus and where are you considering the car? Information, you're almost certainly going to know where your car is, but you might not know where the bus is. There's a little negative against the bus, but in a new town, you maybe don't know the route or where the parking is, so you're sort of fairly even, but generally finding the bus needs a little bit more information, so you're starting slightly behind the curve. The bus stop is not part of your car journey because you go out of your house and get into your car. Generally, even if you have to walk up the street a little bit, you're not standing about outside in the rain waiting for your car. So there's that's one of the two big negatives for public transport that you will come back to in a moment. Punctuality, reliability. Generally speaking, this day and age, cars work and get you there without breaking down. It's very unusual to not get the whole way to your destination, and your car is there because you put it there, so you don't have the not turning up issue. So again, the bus is already 5 points behind. Cost is probably could go either way depending on your bus fares and whether there's car parking, and how, if you include the perceived cost of the journey and the actual cost of owning a car as part of the overall calculation. So generally, there's no real reason why the bus, a good, well-used bus service should be much more expensive. Obviously, if there's 4 people in the car, that's fine. They can crack on. They can take the 4 people in the car. But one person should be cheaper in monetary terms than driving and parking at your destination on a good day with a good service. The journey experience, no real reason why the bus shouldn't be at least as good, because you're not having to drive, so you can sit and play your favorite app on your phone, whatever, as long as all of that comfort and security is in the bus. So generally, the journey ambience shouldn't be too bad. Journey time, it's unlikely the bus will be faster than the car. The destination could be either way, depending where the car park is. But the net result is 5 negatives to the bus because of those ones at the top. So bus fails to compete, everyone drives, lots of congestion, lots of emissions, everybody loses. And because nobody's using the bus services get cancelled, and those who can't use a car don't have a bus. And again, everybody loses. So in an ideal world, now I have the same scoring system. So if you have a good app and everybody knows how to find buses in a new town and in your own town, and it's real-time information about when the bus is coming and whether it's been cancelled and what the route's doing, and you know how to find that and you're able to use a smartphone, then I think you can get rid of the information negative. The wait time you can make as nice as possible. At the bus stop and reduce that. It'll still be a net negative, but you can make it as attractive as possible, not least by getting you out of the rain and making sure the information's there to keep you feeling secure and satisfied the bus is coming. Punctuality, if you really work on your bus reliability and tram reliability and get rid of the congestion that's stopping that reliability, you get a negative. The big one, the one I really want to talk about, and I'm going to see Mark's trying to chase me on here, the one I really want to talk about is the cost. And my view is that you need to make the car cost more than it does at the minute. Parking, congestion charging, etc. Yes, that will affect those who can't use public transport, but the only way you get to an attractive bus is to make the cost of the private car unattractive, and we'll pick that up as in the questions basically. Journey quality, it could be better than driving, why not? And then faster, take the road space and give it to the bus and to the walking pavements, and the pavement to the cyclists, and you end up with a bus journey time that competes with the car, and then everything else stays the same, and you end up bus winning. People take the bus because it's better than the car, not because they have to. It's overall a more pleasant and cheaper experience than the drive and park, and everybody wins. Great bus services, fully used, low emissions, happy days. Not going to talk about my other things, but the things I can talk about if anybody's interested is bus legislation and governance and concessionary fares schemes and evaluating those and designing them, but I haven't time, so I'm going to move back to Mark.
Thank you, David. 10 minutes is never as long as you think. And I'm afraid I can't be as generous as the traffic commissioner with 5 minutes grace, because we want to get to questions which are already coming through. So thank you, David. And next, I will hand over to Gideon.
Thanks both. I'll just start up my presentation here. David talked a lot about the where things stand at the moment and how much better things could be. I think my role here is to talk about the dangers if we don't get there. I'm a senior researcher at the Social Market Foundation. I focus on transport and in particular transport poverty. So what is transport poverty? There's a lot of competing definitions. Accessibility, mobility, and affordability all factor in. Accessibility might mean you don't have any bus stops nearby, they're too far away. Mobility might mean even if you have bus stops there, they don't travel to enough destinations, or there's limited opportunity to transfer. What we focus on is affordability, which tends to affect the two. Affordability poverty when it comes to transport means that the transport may be available, but it's more expensive than people can afford. And due to poor public transport provision, you start to see more and more reliance on cars. You see forced car ownership that costs a lot of money, often more than people can afford, and pushes them into poverty. That's what we're talking about when we talk about transport poverty. We decided to measure this for a few reasons. Since 2003, we've seen problems with transport provision and how those can affect social exclusion. Limited access to jobs, healthcare, education, they all get reinforced when we limit our access to public transport. In 2012, the Hills Review found that focusing on the core problems by measuring them, we can start to figure out solutions. Hills was talking about fuel poverty, but I feel it applies just as much to transport. And in 2022, Green Alliance asked for a specific definition of transport poverty and a measurement of it. I mentioned fuel poverty there, and I mention it because I think it's a really useful example when talking about this. Back in 1970, fuel poverty and transport poverty were both virtually unknown. But over the coming decades, fuel poverty, to mean when people can't afford to heat their home, became a much more common issue in a way that transport poverty never really did. That's a problem because transport poverty tends to be extremely detrimental for the UK. Let's start just with the economic effects. You see declining affordability, increasing poverty, and worse access to jobs when you take public transport away. That feeds into social problems. You see worsening community cohesion, you see more isolation, lower access to education is on there, but you also see lower access to almost everything, daily shops, social opportunities, parks, and of course, healthcare. Limited access to transport means you have lower access to medicine. You have more reliance on cars, which decreases our mobility, our activity, exercise, and of course you have higher particle pollution, which worsens our health. And that, of course, feeds into the environmental problems, right, which nests within all of these transport discussions. Increasing GHG emissions comes from this, worsening waste and pollution, increasing health and climate costs. And of course, that feeds into itself in a worsening feedback loop that we've been seeing in the UK since we started seeing bus cuts in the 2010s. To help understand the really detrimental effects of this, we wanted a metric to measure transport poverty. How many people are pushed into poverty as a result of transport costs? To do so, we wanted to understand the breadth, how many people are affected, the depth, how badly are they affected, how deep in poverty are they, and the region, where are they? We also wanted to give a stable definition for campaigners to use when lobbying government for more public transport costs, and I hope that you do so as well. We also wanted to understand the effects of those policies for government. How much can public transport expenditure decrease transport poverty? How have fuel duty freezes done so, even though they're cast as doing so? And could EVs help? I won't get into the minutiae of how we measured this so much. That's all available on our website. But basically, if you take a household's income and you subtract the transport costs from that, if that household is below the poverty line as a result, that household would be considered in transport poverty. So what did we find? Overall, 8% of the UK households are in transport poverty. Those are located about where you'd expect in the North and the Midlands and less in the South. We've also mapped that at a local authority level. That's all available on our website if you want to see it. Regionally, it's, as I said, about where you'd expect, the North and the Midlands, Scotland as well, and less where you would expect. in the south and London. That means over about 5 million people are in transport poverty, and it tends to be lowest in urban areas, particularly London. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the underlying income. People in cities tend to have a higher income. That means they're more protected from poverty. But you also have costs as well. They have better access to public transport, which means they're spending less because public transport lets them save money that they would otherwise spend on a car. And they have to take a car less. The transport needs tend to be shorter, and so they end up spending less overall. I should add, however, that poverty is also high in suburban areas, those areas that are just outside the cities that don't have as ready access to public transport, and tend to spend a lot of time in their cars. Cars make up a vast majority of our trips in the UK. For 58% of all trips are by car, 85% of all non-walking trips are by car. However, it's even worse when it comes to costs. The average household spent about £5,700 on motoring in 2019. We use 2019 data because it's the most recent data we have from before COVID. Bus and rail tends to be cheaper and we tend to use them less. That means we're left spending a lot less money on it. So the average British household spent about £6,000 on transport in 2019. That's 97% of their transport costs. Overall, they spent about 162 billion per year on cars, and that's on top of public expenditure like highways, road maintenance, safety, all that. The average car journey is pretty expensive. It costs about £6 compared to £241 for the average single bus ticket. A lot of the blame in political circles is focused on fuel duty, and I want to counter that outright. Most of a car's costs are inherent to the vehicle. It's the purchase cost, it's the servicing, the insurance. Fuel duty actually makes up very little. So then we come to what we do about it. Well, like I said, fuel duty has gotten a lot of political attention, and it's the wrong direction. It's cost about 180 billion in lost public revenue over the last 10, 15 years. And despite all that, it's decreased poverty by just 0.3%. That's because those at the top tend to save the most when fuel duty is frozen or cut. The top of the income tends to drive more. They drive less fuel efficient vehicles like SUVs, and so they make more. Whereas those on the bottom end of the spectrum who either don't drive very little, or drive very fuel efficiently, make the least off of these freezes. Yet we have been in a situation where we're spending an incredible amount on fuel duty at a time where we're being told that public transport funds are no longer available and bus services are being cut. That's probably because public transport is probably the most effective way to decrease transport poverty. That graph on the right shows two factors. On the y-axis, you can see the costs of the annual expenditure of public transport per household. And on the bottom axis, you can see the speed of public transport relative to motoring. Basically, those on the lower left corner have faster public transport. They spend the least on transport overall. Those on the top right have slow public transport relative to motoring, and they end up spending the most. Those little gray dots in the bottom left you can see are London, and as you go along that line there, you can see us expand more into the north and the Midlands. For every 10% increase we found in public transport speeds relative to driving, the average household saves about £435. It lets them take the bus more, it lets them save money on driving, and they tend to take that opportunity when they can. Looking at urban areas specifically, of course, public transport isn't going to be available for everyone, but just looking at all major urban areas in the UK, if they had the same kind of public transport as London, poverty would fall by over 1 million. That's about 7%. Urban poverty itself would fall by about 22%. And that's incredibly important when we start to talk about the benefits of public transport expenditure rather than spending more and more on fuel and motoring. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions. I know that was a very quick overview of this. All the information is available on our website, and I understand the slides will be posted online, but happy to answer any questions after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon. I didn't even have to chase you. Next, we have Beata.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. My name's Beata Kubitz. I'm a transport consultant working on future mobility and mobility as a service. I've just published a book about mobility as a service. If you could move the slide on, Mark, which basically the basics are that it's a digital booking and payment platform that enables people to find, so journey planning, and use journey accompaniment, public and shared transport. So everything from trains and buses to micro mobility, bike share, car share, lift sharing. And it's also a tool, shifting people from car ownership to using public and shared transport. And that's where it's interesting, because it's that idea that the car has been completely the default mode of transport. But if you have an app on your phone that's the default mode of transport that helps get you about, it can change behaviour. However, if you look at the UK, you can see that mobility in a service hasn't really taken root. We've had the FTZs and we have the Scottish Government with some projects. And the only mobility as a service app I've actually managed to use within the UK is the Solent one, which was launched earlier this year. And my first reflection was really that this is a metaphor for the transporter in the UK. It does what it says on the tin. It gives you a journey planner for sure. But when you come to choose a journey, you have a choice of different buses, different operators. The ticketing isn't entirely clear. When it comes to payment processing, you get lots of different bills. You don't get this one single bill that you think you'll get at the end of the day, very much as you would with Oyster. It's all very, very fragmented still. And it still has a lack of density of transport, with not all of the operators within the urban area actually included within it. It's getting better and better. I know that Solent's trying very hard, but because it's not obligatory, it's coming along in small steps rather than leaps and bounds. And the third thing is the active travel routes on it are quite limited. There isn't a choice of the type of journey you want to make. Do you want a safe walking route? Do you want lit? It's just, this is a walking path and you get turn-by-turn navigation, and there's no bike navigation. And I find it's very much reflective of the state of where we are in public transport in the UK. If you could look at my next slide. To make mobility as a service work, the density has to be there, the transport has to be there, the infrastructure has to be there, the active travel infrastructure has to be there. It has to be digitalized in such a way that the passenger experience is great, so that people want to go back to that app because it gives them control over their journeys. It's convenient and it's best value, so that every ticket that you get is the best price for the ticket that you want to use. So if you can have my next slide. My first point about the density in the UK is that we tend to think very much about cities and urban transport, what David was saying about the best place scenario. But we know that rural transport, in rural places, people make longer journeys and they make them by car. And in between those areas, we also have a lot more journeys by car and a tendency to drive more and drive longer journeys. So we often say there are less than 20% of the population which is rural, but I would say there's actually only 35% of the population which is an urban major conurbation. If we look at the next slide, we can see Manchester, which I've studied on the Foundation for Integrated Transport Fellowship, where the travel to work patterns are they're great in terms of public transport use within that central zone that at the bottom of the map of Manchester. People drive less, they use public transport more. What's not surprising is that maps almost exactly onto the area of Manchester which has the best public transport accessibility scores. And the people who are driving in these outer areas where the population is less dense. Oldham, for example, has like 1,500 people per kilometre square, and the transport is less dense. So there's a kind of bit of a no-brainer. If you don't have transport, you drive. And then if you drill down further into Bolton, if we look at the next slide, you can see that even within these less dense areas with less good public transport, there's a different patchy picture where some people are still living within quite rural areas, very low population density, very little transport options, and then And then there are others living in high density, well provided for areas. So it's very, very lumpy. And the net result is that you have, I think it was 75% of people I calculated that drive to work within central Manchester are driving from outer boroughs where they have poor transport networks. And in rural areas, for example, in Hertfordshire, it gets even worse. The local authority calculated that 4,000 people around the market town of Buntingford had no access to bus of any kind. But if you think about the frequency and you look at the bus stops based on how often they are called by a bus, it goes up to about 40,000 people who have no access to a bus with any kind of frequency to make it useful. So I think the issue in the UK is very much that we have very little density, and that the information that we have is not necessarily dependable and detailed. I think this is the issue that I find is that the devil is very much in the detail. The devil is in those sensible last mile options and friendly last mile and last meter infrastructure. If we look at the next slide, we can see some of the issues. For instance, on this picture on the left, the pavement is absolutely completely absent. This is a small West Yorkshire town. So it's quite rural, it's a 30-mile-an-hour road, and people in the housing estate on the left do not want to let their children walk to school, which is just over the brow of that hill, because there is no pavement on either side of the road. You have lack of cycle infrastructure once you get away from city centres, where you have people on their hand cycles competing with rural traffic at the national speed limit, 60-mile-an-hour zones. So this is part of the issue that we have in the UK, that there's very little detailed digital information and very little infrastructure and very little provision. I wanted very quickly to glance over the channel with envious green eyes at France, because France has actually got a law that gives everyone the right to transport. And I think this is something, you know, given we've got a new government, we could be advocating for. And this law has provoked a systematic approach to connectivity in France. It's meant that they have regulated their buses. There has an entirely network approach that's been adopted, and they've replaced a lot of low utilised buses with demand responsive transport. They spent a couple of billion euros on cycle infrastructure over the next year or two, and there's also rail, and there's a national approach to on-demand transport data standards, so taxi APIs and mobility as a service. If you look at Orléans, just on the next slide, you can see that the centre of Orléans has got a mass transit network, super busy, very well provided for. Outside of that, there is a guarantee that you will be able to get an on-demand bus that will deliver you onto that network or around your local area. And the way that they've done that is that they've used the same money that they were subsidising local buses with to create an on-demand system. And it's even connected out to village level, with fixed line buses, rail. There's a lot of rural transport that is really built to look good and to be very bold. The governments advocate that people will share their cars. There are little green signs on, showing you can put your thumb out here and people will share your car. There are mobility hubs with airs where you're being really encouraged to park your car and jump into someone else's car, as well as buses, rail. The bus actually calls at the rail station in time for the onward journey. So the conclusions that I have from studying mobility as a service and studying what's going on in the UK is that we very much need to plan our networks to include rural, peri-urban and urban populations, because if we don't include all of our populations, those rural and peri-urban populations will impact on the urban populations, on the city centres. They will want to continue to drive their cars into town centres. The other thing that is really important is that walking, wheeling, waiting is all part of the network. We don't always have that infrastructure there to enable people to get to bus stops, to get to railway stations. And if they can't make the first step out of their door, they're going to do what David said and just get straight into their car. We need bus regulation. I'm not ideologically opposed to free market buses, but we cannot, in the current circumstance, actually plan networks where the last mile will always cost money. It's never going to stand on its own 2 feet and wash its face. It needs to be cross-subsidised by the larger network. And best value has to be foundational for passengers. We can't have this situation continuing where you have to choose 97 different types of ticket and work out whether that's best for you. And journey time and availability always needs to be compared to the car. So we're not accepting second best for people travelling by bus. It's a case of digitalising in detail. Bus, rail, bike share, DRT, taxis, cycleways, pavements, all being available as digital APIs. And I'm talking particularly about some of the on-demand and demand-responsive transport, which don't get integrated into our apps at the moment, because although the companies can provide for the demand-responsive transport, it's not being taken by Travelline. So the answer is yes, Mars, but we need to put in all of the groundwork to get it, to enable it to get people door to door dependably. Thank you very much. Please do get in touch. I'll be happy to answer questions after the presentation.
Thank you very much, Beata. And finally, the last presentation from Melanie, please.
Good morning and thank you. I've spent my career at TfL, TfGM and Cornwall Council, largely delivering infrastructure projects to support buses, both bus priority, traffic management and AVL, iBus in London. I've led operational teams, contract management and developed partnerships with operators to drive change. Also been involved in the franchising cases in Manchester and Cornwall, and delivered Cornwall's bus fares pilot, which was a £23 million DFT initiative. So I feel I've got a good understanding of both the urban and rural transport challenges. And today I'm going to share some thoughts around the components we need to consider improved public transport. So going on to the next slide, the challenge we've been set is how do we develop integrated public transport that can truly compete with the car? And I think, you know, looking at this picture, it is so easy to jump into the lovely flash car. It's convenient, it's attractive. And once you've bought the car, you know, it seems that, you know, you're not paying anything else out. But we can change that. And there's a lovely yellow shiny bus here, Manchester's B network that's currently being rolled out, which is fabulous to see. But it's really, how do we really change the narrative and get some people to make some journeys by public transport? Because just doing that will make such a difference to the public transport market. So going on to the next slide, I'm going to talk through a series of steps that I think we need to be considering when we're thinking about improving public transport. So it's very much starting at the start in terms of who is the customer and what do they want. It's then around getting the basics right, joining things up, the integration piece, considering the bigger picture, because public transport is just part of the picture and we really do need to think wider and make sure that we are more integrated, more joined up with that wider picture. And then I just wanted to, at the end, just talk a little bit about who makes that happen and what we need to deliver success. So on to the next slide, please. So who is the customer? Basically, to deliver effective public transport, we need to better understand the customers and also non-users that aren't choosing public transport. So some are wholly reliant on public transport. It's an absolute lifeline to them. And in rural authorities, you often see that we have socially necessary services that literally change people's lives. But then for other people, buses, public transport, rail, tram may not even be on the radar. You know, so it's really about how do they make a choice around public transport and what can we do to influence that choice? I'm sure most people on this call have heard of Transport Focus, and if not, please do look them up. They have a huge catalogue of established research around the customer and what users and non-users want from public transport. And I've worked with them for years over what their bus passenger surveys telling us. So, you know, just very quickly, reliable journeys, value for money. They've shown how a friendly driver, a friendly bus driver can really change that journey from being a normal journey to being a great journey. So there's some great insight there that should be a starting point for everybody when thinking about the customer. Cornwall Council has also done a lot of work over the years trying to understand what customers want. And I was lucky enough to manage a programme of focus groups that ACOM undertook last year, where we really looked at working with customers, understanding what do they want from a user perspective, but also talking to non-users, talking to visitors to the region to understand what do they want from the public transport system. And it's fascinating what comes out of this. Some of the key findings are that the more people use the bus, the more it becomes part of the routine. So we've got to get people over that first step of actually trying out public transport. Cornwall also found that there was more journeys were being made as a result of the lower fares that they've implemented through the bus fares pilot, which is great news. And Cornwall is one of the few, if not only place, that is back to pre-COVID patronage levels on bus and has seen strong growth over the last 2 years. And another key point that came out of these surveys was that awareness of lower fares and bus as just a general option for people remains a real challenge. So we've got a real awareness issue to overcome if we want to achieve modal shift. So going on to the next slide, the right routes, we've already talked about delivering the basics well, so I'll skip through this quickly, but the right routes, frequency and timetables, as well as a good solid fleet are absolutely key. And again, using Cornwall as an example, they worked with the rail industry to achieve 2 trains per hour through the county through investment in infrastructure and working with the rail industry, Network Rail, GWR. They planned and re-tendered the supported mileage that they have in Cornwall, and they tender over 50% of the mileage. This was awarded to Go Ahead, called a subsidiary, Go Cornwall Bus, under an innovative 8-year contract. And this showed long-term commitment from the local authority to invest in buses. Because it was a longer contract, the operator could invest in 100 brand new buses for the county, something that it hadn't seen. And the council also delivered, through this large contract, more effective mileage, better links, and improved interchange with rail. It also worked in partnership with the main commercial operator, First Group, to deliver investment in vehicles as well, so that the fleet age has really been transformed in Cornwall over the last couple of years. But also it's important that the supporting infrastructure is there. So bus stations, bus stops, mobility hubs, as well as bus priority and traffic management are all invested in, are all there to make sure that buses can run reliably and on time. And as I've mentioned, the right staff, a welcoming and friendly bus driver or station supervisor is key if we want people to really feel welcome and part of the public transport journey. So going on to the next slide, joining things up and integration. Bringing the customer offer together is absolutely key to reducing barriers to public transport. Too often, non-users don't even know where to start, and that isn't good enough if we want to get more people trying public transport. In Cornwall, we fought very hard with the commercial operator to join what is known now as the TFC, Transport for Cornwall brand, leading to one map and one timetable booklet that covered all the routes in Cornwall. And Go Ahead now produce this on behalf of all the operators in Cornwall. So this is a significant achievement that the local authority worked with the operators to deliver. They haven't paid for this, the operators pay for it, which is fantastic. I believe this should be the case everywhere. Operators should be coming together and delivering this across the board, such as in Leicester, where they're doing some great work through their partnership and really coming together to see that bigger picture. We've also got, obviously, Andy Burnham in Manchester delivering the B network. Everything is brought together. There's one brand that covers all public transport, and it makes that whole step for the customer much more easier to navigate. So going on to the next slide is one ticket, which is also absolutely key. And Cornwall went through a hard negotiation with operators to very much standardise tickets. So the descriptions and the validity, so how long is a month, what is a child age, let's standardise this across the board so it's easy for customers to understand. They then agreed interoperability between our operators so that any ticket, any bus, again, very simple to market and very easy for customers to understand. And then they introduced significant discounts across the board, across all their tickets as part of the 23 million bus fares pilot. And if I could just pause a moment to read a quote from one of the from our focus group work. The standardised accepting of tickets across all operators, it's a major thing. Having different operators, different tickets, different times, different timetables, it's just too confusing to consider. So that makes a real difference to me. And that's a quote from our research that we've done. And I think that nicely sums up the value that integration can bring. It has been a game changer in Cornwall. We do need to recognise commercial interests and the need for sustainability for operators, but I believe each area should be delivering greater simplicity as we emerge from the current £2 fares initiative at the moment. So on to the next slide. Bus doesn't operate alone. Public transport, rail, everything. There's a lot more going on that can underpin, support the step change and the move to public transport. So placemaking and developments are absolutely key. Parking and pricing is really important. Again, as part of the public transport improvements in Cornwall, they reviewed their parking policy and pricing alongside the work on public transport, and that led to standardised parking into 3 bands. And they also removed some parking from Truro Town Centre as part of developments and really pushed the park and ride that offered free parking on the outskirts of town. Also, advocates is absolutely key, and as well as incentives, behavioural change and community engagement. We have to use all of these options to really start to change the narrative on public transport. So the next slide. It's all about the vision, the leadership and the delivery. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the resources that need to make these different elements happen. Cornwall did a lot of work around vision. It developed its one public transport system for Cornwall and the elements, the components that supported that. We had a director that really could bring this to life and was successful in selling the vision and securing the funding for them to undertake the work. The leadership is key, being able to drive issues forward, bring partners together, problem solve, negotiate and get tricky issues over the line is key. At Cornwall Council, bringing 2 operators together and getting them both on the same page was a long haul process, but we did it. There's still lots to do and there's still work to evolve. The delivery is also key, bringing the right skill sets together with the right delivery teams so that they can deliver complex elements in a joined up manner is really important. And we should never underestimate the time it takes to get things over the line and to keep stakeholders involved and on board and realise benefits so that you can sell those benefits to achieve further investment. Making sure all these 3 elements are properly resourced is really challenging, particularly within local authority budgetary constraints, but investing in people is key. So just to conclude on my next slide, there's lots of really good best practice around the UK, but the issue is it's not consistent. The National Bus Strategy and the BSIT work and all that investment has brought the public and private sectors together, and it has provided a boost in funding. So we are a step change from where we were a couple of years ago. So this is all great. I see it that the building blocks are in place, but a lot more work needs to be done. Lots more improvement can be made with better collaboration and working together. And it is about us doing things differently, seeing it from the customer perspective and driving through that commitment with all parties. And I think the funding needs to come, absolutely, but you need the building blocks and the vision, the leadership and delivery capability to use it widely. So I'll finish there because I think I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And with that, thank you to all of our panelists for their presentations this morning. We've had a steady stream of questions come through, and I'm sure more will continue to come through. What I will do is I've been making a note of them and kind of working out who to kind of pitch them to first of all. But even if I kind of direct a question at a particular member of the panel, I'll obviously invite all of them to chip in if they wish. So going just through in order of that they were received, Roger Sexton talked about, well, he gave the example of the Swiss model, about the integration of ticketing and timetabling and so on, not just between operators, but between modes. So if it can be done elsewhere, and there are examples of it here, and this is to all of you, what best practice examples would you pluck out that we need to be emulating across the country? David, we'll start with you.
I think that a lot of journeys are one bus to your least place of work or whatever, and you'd make the same journey, and the integration is secondary to that. So the first step, in my opinion, is to make sure that the main journeys that you make are easy and straightforward. For particularly the longer distance stuff, the connection is key, and buses arriving 2 minutes after the train has left, you really should. The integrated timetable is probably more important than the integrated ticket or the integrated fare, but the ability to use your payment and know that you've got the best price and you're not paying 2 or 3 times the integrated ticketing. But I think integrated timetables would be the obvious start, and the fact that you can find them. I think it was Melanie was saying, but you come up with one map or one app that shows you all the buses and trams and trains that you can catch, not different apps or different operators and different maps or different operators. So generally, information that allows people to find the most convenient journey that correctly connects with the next one is the most important, I think. So shared single app for all modes, including demand responsive where appropriate.
Thank you. Gideon?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely agree with the point about information sharing. Of course, that would have to come with you seeing the information you want to see, wanting to see integrated timetables, better scheduling, as you say. And I think there are a lot of international examples that we can look to for that. Japan is excellent at that, for example. Most of East Asia is. But then closer to home, it will also require some public investment, right? Manchester's shown that, other places have shown that, where you will need to start seeing some public investment in transport to get to these areas that are no longer commercially viable. I mean, private providers would be providing these services if they could, but to be honest, a lot of them operate at a loss. That doesn't mean they operate at an economic loss. Access to jobs are hugely beneficial, access to education hugely beneficial, but it will require some public subsidy.
Thank you. Beata?
I'm going to agree vehemently. So I think that the problems that I see a lot is just this lack of access to transport for the last mile, particularly in sparsely populated areas, but you still see in pockets of urban areas as well. And I do talk quite a bit about demand responsive transport. And one of the really good examples that I've seen is in Cheshire, the iTravel scheme, which brought a DRT system to an area that's quite well served by rail, but didn't have any buses that went from the larger population area towards the rail stations. And that I think is a good an example of good practice, because it's a system that's enabled people to get the train. It's also enabled people to visit the countryside as well, which is, so you can have people arriving at rural stations and being able to enjoy the countryside in a car-free way from outside. They live in urban areas and maybe they aren't able to get away from the urban area in which they live without a car, which is another reason that people buy cars. So I think we really need to be looking at this very low density areas and making sure that they're provisioned with transport. One of the reasons that DRT tends to work is that it doesn't go around all the houses, so your journey times are compressed. The problem that you often get is if you have an area of diffuse population, even a housing estate, the bus needs to go all the way around all the houses to make sure that everyone doesn't have a huge long walk to get to the bus stop. And no tutting that we shouldn't be making those walks short for people, because people do have mobility issues, 2 kids and a lot of shopping, and so that the DRT only goes to where it's booked, so your journey time is reduced, rather than having to do a timetabled traffic commissioner regulated route. So yeah, I'm a fan of DRT. It's the downside is the digitalization. Not that the DRT isn't well digitalized, it's beautifully digitalized. It's that our journey planners that we use in the UK, that we pump out to Google via Travelline, don't incorporate GTF Flex, the Google standard for flexible transport at the moment. So they don't get surfaced in journey planners, which is a problem, frankly.
Thank you. And Melanie?
You're on mute.
Still on
Melanie,
mute.
you're on mute, Melanie.
Apologies. I agree entirely about the fact that all modes should be connecting and not competing. We've done a lot of work in Cornwall around how, resources are tight. There isn't, the resources out there now for competing bus services, and we need to get real. We need to sort out, and we will need to work together with operators, with local authorities, everybody in a room, and sort out what networks we need. And we've done a lot of that in Cornwall, and I think a lot more areas need to be bolder in terms of their approach, and the operators need to be coming to the table, because it's a different attitude now. Things have moved on post-COVID. There's a lot of support going into the industry, and we need to now work out, what is the new norm around how networks will be delivered.
Thank you. Beata, a question I think probably best for you from Tony Mulaney, saying why are taxis not considered a solution where there are no buses? And I suppose that will feed into the sort of you mentioned DRT a moment ago. Yeah, taxis as part of the solution.
It's a really interesting question. I think that there are a couple of answers. One is that sometimes they are. Sometimes you do have taxi sharing systems, and that's more we see that more in the continent, to be absolutely honest, and small vehicles. One of the issues is a pricing issue. Taxis fares are VAT, attract VAT. Public service vehicles do not attract VAT. So and that's an issue of size. So that makes it quite difficult to have a demand responsive transport system and right size your fleet, as they like to say, which means use a smaller vehicle than eight seats. Another is accessibility for mobility, people in wheelchairs, with guide dogs. Taxis aren't fully open and accessible like that, private hire vehicles, depending on the regulation and where they are. So and then there's cost. If we're talking about transport poverty, if a taxi fare is excessive, then it's beyond people's reach. Having said that, one of the things that I have observed very regularly living in the north of England, when I did, we would see a lot of people turn up at the supermarket on the bus, but get a taxi home because they had so much transport. So there are, people consider them part of their public transport options for sure, but they're in a bit of a grey area, partly because of the way that they're taxed, and partly because of the disabled access. And then do we look at restrictive pricing, or have a publicly accessible taxi on a fixed fare at certain times of day, like they do in Brussels, for instance? After the public transport network has closed down, the taxis are all given over, and they have a public transport fare style service to ensure that people get home I think it's after about 2 in the morning. So yeah, there's no reason it shouldn't be, but there are some parts of the pie, the parts of the piece that need to be considered.
Thank you. Melanie, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just in terms of taxis, certainly in rural areas, you know, there's a massive shortage of taxis in rural areas, and very much so they are tied up with home to school transport. So in Cornwall, we use loads of taxis for home to school transport. It was almost impossible to get a taxi in the AM peak if you just want to make a normal taxi journey. So I absolutely think taxis are part of the solution. I think everything that Beatrice said around regulation and everything does need to be looked at, but there's also a massive shortage of taxis, full stop, just to make normal journeys and to support the wider areas of home to school, particularly in rural areas. So, you know, it's not just an easy answer. Thank you.
Thank you. A question that's just come in there, kind of related, and Melanie and Beata, both of you feel free to comment about, we've heard in a previous webinar that collaboration between DRT, taxis, community transport, parcel delivery, all these sorts of things could be a solution. So, you know, in the age of Amazon and everything else, is the old-fashioned post bus something that could make a comeback? Melanie, I'll start with you.
So I know Cornwall have done a lovely example working with a community transport, where the community transport bus is providing links into the mainline bus service. So, you know, it's slow and steady. They've got to work out, you know, is that viable longer term? But there are opportunities out there. I think we do need to be innovative, and we do need to be looking outside the box, particularly in some of the very rural areas, because we're never going to be able to provide transport for everybody through mainline bus services. So yes, I think there's options out there, and we need to give things a go.
Thank you, Beata.
For sure. I think that one of the things that we don't do very well in the UK is work out, you know, who is entitled, who should be allowed, who should have public transport. And there's a kind of, in some places, there's a de facto acceptance that no one's going to get public transport, and is that terribly equitable? Is that fair? You know, there is a massive issue, massive question whether it's fair to have public transport in city centres only and not in rural areas. Once you get out to, if you decide that you do want to have public transport, then how do you make it as cost effective as possible? I don't think you can ever make it cost neutral to have last mile rural transport in public or in local authority terms. But are you enabling those people to get onto mainline rapid transit networks? Quite often you are. I noticed that someone was asking about the Buntingford DRT and whether it connected with train stations. The answer is yes, and those are the most popular stops on the virtual stops in that system are Royston Station, Stevenage Station. So then it may be costing a lot of money, but the people are then buying train tickets and using the rest of the network, and we don't really seem to be able to work out how to balance that out in the UK. Yes, community transport can be part of public transport. Community transport operators, in my experience, have been fall over themselves. There is a certain sector of them anyway that fall over themselves to use new tools and new ways of operating, like DRT software. Can they, you know, and trying to work out whether they can group together passengers, people, parcels, all of those different things. But it's tricky, you know, we're not set up legislatively to do it at the moment. We're not really set up to to incorporate taxis into a public transport system at the moment. Community transport, there's some, you know, it can be done using section 19 and 22, but to an extent, but we need to have a rethink, and I think we probably need to have a bit of a fundamental rethink about how we serve those people and what density of population we serve with public transport, or do we just accept that they all have to have cars and move with if they can't drive?
Thank you. Your point about a fundamental rethink. There's a few questions that have referenced legislation, which obviously is by no means a small topic. But you know, for example, John Carr asked, is the direction of travel with BSIPs sufficient to achieve modal shift and meet net zero targets? Roger Sexton was saying, you know, should we have legislation that covers all modes rather than kind of individual pieces of legislation for separate modes? Would that be too unwieldy, or do we just lack ambition? Things like that. So to each of you, I'll go down the line, starting with David. What's the elevator pitch for your kind of ideal legislative solution to fill a gap that we currently have?
The car journey should not be cheaper than the public transport alternative in areas where there is either a demand responsive or a scheduled bus service. That service should be no more expensive and perceived no more expensive than the car. And BSIP is covering one side of that by improving the bus, but I still think that the car is too cheap. The use of the car is too cheap, and cost of living crisis and everything else. I fully understand that, but you will not have an attractive, viable, well-used public transport that's valued by the community if it is costs you perceived cost of 3 times more in either journey time or cost than driving. You will always be benefiting the car driver, and therefore the excluded people will have a less good service, and it will wither in the vine, because if you get a car you don't use the bus, and young people buy a car because they don't have a bus, etc., etc., and it's a vicious circle. So my thing is make the bus or the public transport journey as attractive as the car journey as your aim. And the easiest way to do that is to tackle both sides of that with funding for public transport at one side and increasing the cost of car use at the other.
Thank you. Gideon?
I feel like I'll just plagiarize David's point, but I basically agree. I disagree a little. I think cars already are more expensive than buses, and they're already pushing people into poverty. I think the bigger issue is to make that clear to people, for one, that this is not normal, that the amount you're spending on transport does not need to be this way. It's a political choice. And then to make the alternative available. And that's going to require money. I think the buses bill is a major step forward. I think it's absolutely necessary to improve our transit systems, but it's insufficient, right? It will allow councils to provide on the basis of need rather than money, but they will still need money on their own to get there. And we haven't yet seen any commitment from government on that front.
Just follow on from that, Gideon, about there was a question as well about, from Bettina Lang, saying that even if driving and parking were more expensive, would this be enough to deter the wealthy who tend to drive the kind of the gas guzzling SUVs? You referenced fuel duty, which is obviously politically very tricky to touch, hence why it's been frozen for so long. But yeah, what would be your specific comment on that about the wealthy who don't really mind what they pay?
I've been calling for increases to fuel duty for a few years now, and I was known as the sacrificial lamb of my department for doing so. But now, all of a sudden, you're seeing real discussions about raising it in ways that I never thought possible. That can dissuade them a little. Your goal is not to convince the most car-loving, driving-loving person. Your goal is to convince that marginal person who's wavering on the fence about whether they want to drive or take public transport, or who's not on the fence at all, who says, I would love to take public transport, but it's not available. I agree that from an environmental perspective, we need to get the wealthy to drive less. I think sticks like fuel duty, like ULEZ, are useful in that regard. But if we actually want to decrease poverty, if we want to increase social inclusion, and yes, if we want to decrease GHG emissions, the goal are those marginal people or the people who would take public transport if it were available.
Thank you. Beata, elevator pitch on legislation?
Oh, that's tricky. I have to say that above everything that I've heard today, the one thing that I want to take away is that the freezing fuel duty caused less than 1% reduction in transport poverty for all that time and all that money that has been put into freezing fuel duty. It's just a very, very big discrepancy between the money put in and the reduction in poverty and transport poverty. So I'm not going to add anything to everybody else's priorities. I'm just going to hold that fact and remember to repeat it next time I see a politician.
Melanie?
So support everything that's already been said, but to try and bring something different in here, I would like to see a large-scale behaviour change information campaign, similar to drink driving back in the day, that actually really sells the value and benefits of public transport. We've got to change hearts and minds around public transport. And it's not about giving up your car. It's about making some journeys by public transport. If we all made one journey a month by public transport, the amount of revenue that would bring in to drive change is huge. So just getting those few extra journeys from everybody, because let's face it, there's going to be some people that are never going to change. They are never going to get onto public transport, and that's fine. Let them be, but let's try and convert those that we can. And that will bring in more revenue to the system, which will then enable us to improve the system overall.
Yeah, I think I personally was quite encouraged by your enthusiasm for marketing campaigns, because that used to be part of my role when I was working for an operator, and we were referred to as the colouring in department. And I think you're right, it can't be overstated the importance of selling the value of bus services. Melanie, another one for you actually, or to begin with you, is from Owen O'Neill about how do we factor in personal security and antisocial behaviour, because of course that's not a trivial factor when it comes to deciding whether or not to use public transport. We've got examples of, we've seen certainly in Scotland an increase of antisocial behaviour with the under 22s free travel, which is on the one hand a good thing, but on the other hand has had consequences. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so absolutely, this is a really key issue. We must have a safe environment for people to use public transport. It's so key. And there's been, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of evidence growing, particularly around women and public transport and the threats that they can encounter. So I know Manchester is putting huge amounts of work into, people on the bus. I can't remember what they're calling them, PCOs or something, where they're going around, they're out on the network, they're visible on the network. Of course, this adds an added layer of cost to provision of public transport, but we must make people feel safe. Again, it's about changing behaviours as well. So again, I go back to the information campaign. People need to be, clear that they can actually raise these issues and they will be taken seriously. So again, British Transport Police are doing a lot of, there's a lot of good work there. There's a lot of training being done by operators so that the bus drivers, for example, know what to do if there is an incident on board the bus. And of course, we've got CCTV on our public transport system, so it should be a safe environment. We just need to make sure that we've got that added support around the system, and when things do go wrong, when incidents happen, we can deal with them quickly and effectively to prevent, further escalation of these things.
Thank you. Chris Buck asked about car clubs and whether they can kind of credibly replace car ownership in the future, because of, if there's no sunk cost, people would be more likely to use them only when it's necessary, kind of like what Beata was saying about there are certain journeys that really we're not trying to convert them all, but just where possible. And there's a new generation where ownership of things is kind of less common. The idea of communal sharing things is more common, and of course the impact of working from home. So Beata, I'll probably begin with you. Do you see any kind of long-term change to the cultural desire to own a car, even if not using them altogether?
Yes, I think the car club membership has grown every year for as long as I can remember. So I think we are seeing a change, and I think car clubs are also a part of this conversation. Absolutely, definitely. For those they're amazing for helping people not to go to two cars. They're the occasional car that you don't have, so you only need one car within a family. They're great for that. And I was on a webinar just yesterday about bike sharing, where I had where the CIE, the the European Federation of Cycling were talking about car clubs and car sharing being a part of that whole conversation. It's not just bike sharing, it's other shared resources. People getting used to sharing those things and enabling them to pursue a less car dependent lifestyle. So it works. There are, car clubs also need support. We've had an almost wholly private sector model of car clubs in the UK, but they could be something that is more supported just by the provision of parking spaces and integrated into local transport plans better. And that will definitely help this changed mobility mix. And they integrate really well in mobility as a service platforms as well. So if you have the mobility as a service tool at your fingertips, you can then find your car club, car bike share, or even lift sharing. So yes, car clubs, good thing. And there is a quietly growing number of people joining them. The only downside is, again, it's the rural car clubs, because we have problems sourcing insurance for rural car clubs at the moment, the smaller bodies. So those sorts of community initiatives where people are pooling their resources, which are the kinds of things we all would applaud, that model's currently under threat because there are no car insurance providers willing to step into that market.
Okay, thank you. Melanie, you were agreeing at the end there. Would you like to chip in your thoughts on that one?
No, just I absolutely agree with everything that's already been said, but it is a major issue in terms of this insurance issue. And something needs to be done to put that right, because we should be able to, let communities get on with this sort of stuff. And the fact that, we're losing car clubs because of this issue is just simply not good enough in this day and age.
I would say that the car clubs go well with measures like ULEZ, where you're banning the use of certain vehicles or old cheap vehicles, basically. So for people who used to only be able, and probably still can only afford an old cheap vehicle, they could join a car club and get a nice shiny vehicle for the time they need it. And in particular, like the suggestion from Beata, that it'll tackle some of the two-car. So if you get or want to use your own electric car or whatever, having access to something that will allow you to take all of your furniture to the dump or drive to the Scottish Highlands, or whatever it might be, as effectively cheaper than hiring a car for the day for that one trip to the dump, allows you to drive an efficient car for the other 9 days out of 10, basically, for when you need a car for scooting about. Use the car club for the big diesel Ford Galaxy that you currently have, or I currently have, that I need to get rid of. If I had a good, or was to explore the car club option for that second car, as well as not to need a car at all, but to have access to one. So I think they are part of the solution, and I think they go hand in hand with ULEZ type restrictions that make it harder, and hopefully harder, to own polluting and emitting vehicles. So use the car club as the step towards not needing a car at all.
Good, thank you. Gideon, just on that as well, changing attitudes to car ownership, are you aware, is there any evidence yet of that attitude changing with the rise of working from home and the less need to commute and so on? Are people getting rid of their cars?
People are still buying cars. The main issue that I find with car clubs, totally in favor of them, the benefit that they bring is that they allow those people who are only using it once a week, right? The people who are using it for their weekly shop. David mentioned the ones who are only using it to, take a trip up to the Scottish Highlands. And the pitch I would make is not on environmental basis, but again, on a cost basis. You're going to save thousands.
Okay, thank you. Beata, Matt Cottam asked about, well, he kind of commented about mass and a barrier to it being, especially for local authorities, being the high cost of development versus limited commercial viability. And he said, besides more government funding, how could this be overcome? And there was another talking about, lots of places, even metro areas. Yeah, and Anzi Ibudu, metro areas with more powers and resources have made noises about mass for years, but few ideas seem to have gotten off the ground. Why do you think this is, and how can it be changed?
So I think we've got a unique problem in the UK with deregulated buses, and I think that's in the UK is a blocker to private sector versions of mobility as a service, because you can't. It's just very, very complicated to put lots of different ticketing systems, lots of different operators, and to provide the kind of engaging system that you really want. That having said, the UK has been good at creating journey planners. It's just the pricing and ticketing piece that is very difficult to bring in, and for that we've needed local authority engagement. The pump priming, the money that the DfT gave Solent, the West of England and Nottingham Derby has gone on, yes, building an app. Yes, that does have costs, but a lot of the costs are actually those preparatory costs of trying to get everybody onto the same page, trying to create the commercial and business model agreements that enable operators to have their tickets booked and paid for, and within apps. How will that work in the long term? Does it always need public funding? Interesting question. We had the loss of the first public-private sector mobility as a service model, the WIM app, over the course of COVID. So I think the answer is more, what do you want your MaaS app to do? If you want your MaaS app to be an instrument for helping people to give up their cars or use their cars less, for providing them with information that says, yes, you're going to come into my clean air zone, so we prefer you to park your car in this car park and use the public transport onwards, and provide public service information and behaviour change nudges, then I think that's something that there will always be a public sector cost involved. If you want a MaaS app that just bundles together a certain number of providers and maybe a ticketing operation, then it might not be a public sector thing, but you won't have the chance to change public behaviour as part of that. Yeah, I think the blockers here are largely buses and sometimes digitization, and people being willing to give up data sets and integrate them, or wanting to be part of one commercial clique and not another. So it gets very complicated at that stage.
So you think that only kind of with some form of regulated or re-regulated framework can these players be basically compelled to participate in whatever platforms are developed?
I think the proof of the pudding is in the fact that we've not got them yet, whereas other European countries have got things that are much more like mobility as a service, and much more engaging and much more inclusive of public, shared and private, public transport and shared transport off the ground, whereas we don't have, and we are the only place that has a deregulated bus network.
Okay. On infrastructure, David, I'll start with you. Owen O'Neill was talking about, I think, interurban services. No, it wasn't Owen O'Neill. It was. Talking about interurban services where when they kind of reach a city boundary, they just get stuck in the same congestion as everything else. And you got the lost productivity, more resources, less revenue, less passengers, and so on and so on. That cycle of decline. And of course, most bus services aren't interurban; they're urban, so they're spending pretty much all of their time in that congestion. Bearing in mind the kind of alarm raising from government, UK, devolved, and otherwise about the lack of money. For example, the Scottish Bus Partnership Fund being paused indefinitely. What solution do you see to that to get buses moving faster?
The obvious one is to give them the right to effectively a free congestion-free route in, and then worry about what you do with the remaining traffic that no longer has 2 lanes where it used to have 2 and has no lane at all because you've given it over to a bus only or a bus gate. That should be your ambition as in an urban area, is that your buses do not sit in Unpredictable congestion, obviously, if there is sort of a steady journey time, you can build that into your timetable and you know what's going to take. It's whenever you don't know when your bus is coming, it's now late, it takes longer to get everybody on board because they've all been standing there waiting, etc., and it gets later and later. Your bus is unreliable, people don't use it the next time, and they sit and they take their car and cause the congestion that caused the problem in the first place. So aspirational step one is to look at your bus network. Where is the congestion causing it a problem, and tackle the traffic at that point, whether by a low emission zone or reallocation of road space or whatever. But generally, you should start with the assumption that the bus has the right to do its journey at something approaching free flow speed between one stop and the next. And then, obviously, I mean, that is so idealistic. I'm embarrassed just to have said it, but that you should start from that as your ambition and work your way down. And it doesn't require obviously the quality bus partnerships and whatever will help fund that, because they'll save more in driver time and fuel and ultimately patronage than it costs them to put the signs in or put the bus gate in. The people that won't accept that are the motorists who are now not able to drive to the door of where it was they used to drive to the door of. So your politicians will have to be brave, but it's not hard. There's not that many buses, so no reason why they can't. I mean, there's obviously some routes where the buses get in each other's way, but generally speaking, if you get the buses flowing freely and then worry about where that road space has come from, rather than just having them stuck in the same traffic as the cars. And it's a great incentive for bus use. If you see the bus going past your stationary queue of traffic in the morning, and you see it again tomorrow and the day after, you start thinking, where's the park and ride site? So free flowing buses is your aim, and you just keep working at it until you've achieved that.
Okay, thank you. Melanie?
I think on this whole point, I mean, urban areas are, very congested for various different reasons. So it's really trying to understand what is causing the congestion, and it can vary from roadworks. So tackling roadworks and having proper systems and processes in place to manage roadworks, permit systems, lane rental, all that sort of thing. So there's a lot further that local authorities can go to actually manage roadworks. Both from putting systems in place, but also from working in partnership. So working with utility providers to get best practice ways of working agreed when they're putting in roadworks, as well as the whole management of those roadworks. So that's one area. There's then indiscriminate parking. So again, that's around enforcement strategies and making sure you've got proper enforcement in place that is responsive and can deal with issues as and when they arise. So Manchester is actually doing a huge amount of work in this area, particularly with franchising, because now if a bus takes longer, it's their cost. And so it's going to be really interesting how Manchester pans out and how quickly they get on top of the indiscriminate congestion and how they manage roadworks going forward. I know I continue to support Manchester with the franchising work, and I know there is much more focus around this now than there has ever been in Greater Manchester before. So I watch with interest, as I think we all should. Thank you.
Sorry, Mark, I can't work out how to raise my hand. But
Go on.
a very, very quick win is boarding times. The number of times I've got on buses in the UK where you have 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds per passenger. So if you've got 10 people getting onto a bus, that's 5 minutes of stationary bus. That's just ridiculous. And the ways that is dealt with is through ticketing, not having the bus driver telling the bus driver where you're going, having the bus driver typing out a thing. And even in this day of £2 fares, I have been on a bus, operator shall be named withheld, where the bus drivers have been taking the destinations at the door, and so the people get the queue has diminished slowly and steadily, and to everyone's extreme pain and torture who's sitting on that bus. So bus operators sorting out their ticketing, speeding up boarding could take like hours out of your day in terms of journey times.
Yeah, and mandating things like multi-door and things like that for lighting at the same times.
Oyster style ticketing or mass, she says. Yeah, her stall.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you all very much. We're approaching time. It's a minute to go. So thank you all. Thank you to the panelists for joining us, and thank you to all of you for joining as well. As I said earlier, this is the first in a series of webinars about integrating public transport so that it can compete with private cars. You can see on the screen here the details of the following sessions. So please do register. They are all free to attend. And similar to this one, even if you didn't get a chance to ask your question today, there may be a chance for you to do so later on. So thank you all very much.